Good morning, everybody. We will be starting the webinar very shortly, so don't go away. We will be commencing in a very few minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome on behalf of UX Global Group to today's session, the Chancellor's Conundrum, Autumn Budget 2025. We'll be starting in just about 5 minutes, so we kindly request you to stay connected and not leave the session. Thank you for your patience. We look forward to an insightful session today.
Okay, can you hear us, everybody? Pooja, can you hear us?
Yeah,
Excellent, excellent. Good morning, everybody, and apologies for the late start. The security in the Shard, I can confirm, works absolutely comprehensively. He's going to get into this building without authorization. So anyway, welcome to the first in a new series of tax webinars, which the Worshipful company of tax advisors has launched to mark its 30th anniversary. And I'm delighted that to kick off this series, the first webinar, we are joined by Chris Sanger, who's going to talk to us this morning about the conundrum that the Chancellor faces in the autumn budget on the 26th of November, just 5 weeks away now. As one of the UK's leading commentators on tax policy, Chris needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one briefly because he deserves one and because we're grateful that he has found time in his busy schedule to join us this morning. So for those of you who don't already know, Chris is the EY's leader of UK tax policy and global government tax. In a former life, he was head of business tax at the Treasury. He's a member of the United Nations Subcommittee on Extractive Industries taxation issues, and he's held senior roles with the Chartered Institute of Taxation, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, and the Institute of Fiscal Studies. You will almost certainly have seen, heard, or read his commentary in the various media, and I always enjoy when he appears on the Today programme over breakfast. Chris, welcome. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. You've called this webinar the Chancellor's Conundrum. The reality is that recent Chancellors are very constrained by what they can do to solve conundrums or conundra, whichever is the correct plural, by geopolitics, global markets. Their hands are very much tied, aren't they? Perhaps we could start by exploring the environment Rachel Reeves finds herself in.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. And again, apologies for being slightly late. Apparently, I was too security cleared at the building, and I never thought I could be too secure. But there we go. Yes, I think you're right. We put the conundrum, and of course, the conundrum comes down to the kind of three elements of that you've got when you balance your books: your borrowing, your taxation, and your spending. And I think that's something that the chancellors of recent times have had more of a challenge over than at least when I was in Treasury. Because when I was in Treasury, we would predict based on the cautious case, and the economy would come in at about mid case, and you'd always have a little bit of extra money available every budget, which basically could offset the naturally prudent approach that Treasury takes when it does its costings, and now what the OBR does in its costings. So you always have those kind of elements, but I think you're right. It has got a lot harder under recent governments, not just this one, but the predecessors and the ones before that. If we just go onto the slide, I was going to try and pick up kind of three key areas. Which is that coming forward? Yeah, there we go. So I was going to look at the international and geopolitical context, pick up a little bit of the macro, and then I was going to try and answer your questions about what might we see in 37 days time. I mean, I'm not sure. I think the kids are counting the days down to Christmas. I'm not sure we should be counting the days down to budget, but yeah, I think at last count it is about 37. And so if we just go to the next slide, I'll start answering your question just in relation to the overall piece, because I do think you need to think of it in the absolute context and where the UK sits as a whole. You'll be very familiar with the report that EY Geostrategic Outlook produced on the left-hand side, which basically looks at the kind of, you can tell they're consultants, aren't they? 2x2 matrices. And if you look, you can see we used to be in the globalization or globalization light, and you can see we've been having some fairly drift down and probably leftways into that more of a kind of nationalist approach and distinct blocks. So moving into the kind of moving into the friends first, and then for some sectors, we've seen that move into much more of a kind of, we put Cold War II, which is those areas where actually you want to have that part of the economy operating in your country where you can really do it. And that changes a lot of the nature of foreign direct investment, where you're going to go and get your foreign direct investment. And the challenge with that means that for an economy like the UK, which is really focused on bringing investment into the UK and seeing that actually acts as a constraint. And if you think about what that means for businesses, here's comes from our EY attractiveness survey that we looked across Europe, and I make sure that says Europe, not EU, as we are obviously still part of Europe. And you can see that we asked the question about have you postponed, cancelled, or scaled back investment plans in Europe, and you can see that over a third of people have actually done so as a reaction to the kind of economic environment in which we're in. And again, if we're focused on FDI, that's a kind of real challenge. And you can see the breakdown of those numbers. As an accountant, I should point out that does not add up to 100, because you can be both postponing and scaling back. So
That took me a bit of time to.
yeah, don't criticise me on my mathematics. I may have been in Treasury, but it's not that bad. If we go to the next slide, though, let's have a look at what that current position is for the UK. So if you were asking a few years ago, you might have thought the economy was on a reasonable state. But if you look, we've got quite a lot of upsets in your treasury environment if you're trying to work your way through that. Whether that be the US tariff policy, which has been obviously getting a huge amount of press and attention, and rightly so, or whether it's actually just been the international tensions, the unstable growth, technology, for example, with the great benefits you get from Gen AI, it does mean you're fighting a very different battle for investment. Does that overturn, if you like, the strengths that certain economies have had as like barriers to entry for others, because it allows people to leapfrog? So you've got all of these things which are pretty difficult to predict.
Chris, the B word isn't on that slide. I saw Rachel Reeves reported over the weekend talking about how we left the European Union is also a factor that I would certainly class as disarray. Or is that in the past now?
Well, I mean, I think if we'd had a clean period of time post Brexit, you might have been able to analyse it. I think it's quite difficult to analyse what was the result of Brexit, what was the result of COVID.
Yeah.
So I think some of that analysis is quite difficult to disaggregate, and I think that's why we haven't really included in that. But I mean, I think if you look at kind of cross-border trade and tariffs, I'd probably include that within that. I've tried to have a presentation that didn't mention the word.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. I only raised it because the Chancellor did.
Well,
the IMF.
That is true. And you can see down on the on the bottom of the slide, you can see the quotes we've got from the IMF from I think only last week in terms of the lower growth prospects. Plus also the fact that the OECD is pointing out that actually there are higher levels of debts, higher spending needs, particularly if you think about what defence means. You're actually, if you wanted a nice easy job as a Chancellor, you wouldn't have taken the job right now. You've got all of these things coming through, and that gives you all the things you can see in the top right, the challenges facing the government, all the way through to fiscal strain, which we're talking about here. And then, of course, that being represented by businesses more widely. So that's it's a bit of a challenge for, I'd have thought, for any Chancellor in this environment, particularly one that has made commitments in a manifesto less than or just over a year or so ago. If we go to the next slide, I mentioned the tariffs. You can see that the impact of tariffs, they've not yet really come all the way through. We've seen the tariff increases, but if you look at what the impact, you can see that we're forecasting here in the 2026 forecast a greater drag on growth compared to the no tariff one. So although the decisions have made, there's more pain to come as that works its way through. And you can see the chart on the right hand side just brings it stunningly close to see what the impact of those tariffs have been since the US president came into power, and the uncertainty that creates. That's probably covering the global environment. Let me get to I think the questions we're talking about in terms of the conundrum in the UK market. And if we look to the next slide, I always think it's worth just reminding us of what we're actually seeing in here. If you look at those seats charts that you've got there, you've got Labour have got 62% of the seats in the House of Commons, which is normally a huge majority and would allow you to get a lot of things through. However, I point out that there's only 34% of the vote. So if you think that's a big disparity between 62% of seats and 34% of the vote, and that means that many of those seats, maybe even 20% of those, are kind of sitting on a knife edge. And if you were a Labour MP sitting on a knife edge, you'd be thinking, I've got to actually become more popular at the next election than I am now. And that makes it very difficult for what a government normally does, which is it gets into power, it does all the uncomfortable and horrible things that it needs to do, such that actually you get the benefit of that in the 4 or 5 years later. And of course, this used to be the cycle. If you were to plot all the ones, I mean, take Gordon Brown. I think in Gordon Brown, when he came in '97, we had the windfall tax on the privatised utilities, the 5.2 billion that went into I think it was into Sure Start and fed through that. But then by the time you got to the end of those 5 years, you'd actually seen the benefit of those things. We kind of lost that during the COVID period because we had to deal with COVID. And that's one of the reasons why I think the Conservative administration had that real challenge, because they tried to compress that 5 years into 2 years. And if you think about where we are on politics now, that's actually a much smaller effective majority than actually the seats would show. So there's a real question about, can you bring your people with you? If you look down the rest of it, we've seen the strong focus on economic growth, plan for change. We have seen the fiscal rules, and we've seen the commitments that has been made by government in there. So they've effectively set out where they wanted to be, all based on their understanding going ahead into the election, back in that Labour's Partnership for Business document that it produced. But if you jump to the next slide, you can see they've got a real challenge with all of this, and this kind of, I always call it a hockey stick, but there's actually not much of a dip before you get there, so it's probably just more of a rise. This is basically showing you the long-term projections of debt as a percentage of GDP all the way through to 2072, and you just look at that, you're seeing if we're debt to GDP around about 100%, and to remember in context, before the global financial crisis, we were about 40%. When the global financial crisis came in, we had a big jump or a big transition up to around about 70 or 80%. And that was a higher increase for us than it was for France or other countries that didn't have such a big exposure to financial services. And then we get COVID on top of that, which has taken us to the 100 that we're at around about now. So that's the kind of look we've got to. But unless we do something about that, we are going to see those debt levels getting up to 270% by
when would it last
2030.
as high as this?
Well, I may have a chart on that later on,
Yeah,
but
okay.
I mean, but when we get, normally what we look at is tax to GDP ratios. And the last time we got to that was the kind of Second World War type of stages. But this is basically showing you the effluxion of time and the fact that we've got a gap. Our current budget in last year's term, I think we raised about 1 trillion in tax revenues, and we spent 1 trillion plus about 115 billion in interest. So if you actually look at the that 120 billion, that was the difference. We were actually balanced other than for the interest, and it's the interest that is basically coming on this. And if you go to the next slide, the reason this matters, the chart you can see on the right hand side gives you the kind of 30-year government bond yield, and you can see the range that you got in blue, and I think it's blue on colourblind. Is it blue? Yes, thank you. That's giving you the G7 ones, and you can see the UK is out of kilter, and that's basically showing you that the market is really worried about all of this too. It's just not the fact that the Chancellor's worried about it; it's actually the market, and that's one of the things that's really hitting our cost of debt and making that chart you saw before becoming so big. If you could reduce the interest rate cost, then it wouldn't increase as such, but you've still got to be able to balance the books at some point. And if you look at that kind of where we were before, you can see the left-hand chart gives you the kind of headroom status. When we were at the spring statement, we had, I think it was 9.9 billion. I think it almost looks like 10, doesn't it? 9.9 billion of headroom. And that's the gap Chancellor has to meeting her fiscal rules. Now, it sounds like quite a big amount of money, and I'd love to have 9.9 billion, thank you very much. But when you think of an economy that's, the tax you're getting is, by the end of this parliament, 1.3 trillion, 1 trillion right now, that's a really small margin when you think about it. And you can see that's why it's kind of been used up by the various different adjustments we saw. So we had the changes in relation to the winter fuel payments, which originally were set at a very low level and then increased for the cap, I mean. Then you've got the welfare reforms, gilt yields, and then you've got the weaker growth forecast, which is predicted by the OBR, bringing their productivity forecast back to what has been the more usual norm over the last few years, rather than the more optimistic ones. And you can see that gives you a kind of you've used up the 10 billion or 9.9 billion, I shouldn't exaggerate, of headroom, and you've probably got about 15 or 20. And I've seen targets, I've seen things that are saying you're up to about 40 or 50 if you want to be secure. And remembering, if the Chancellor is going to go back to that, that's actually a reasonably significant tax rise. But if she wants not to have to be playing this game year in, year out, and having to do the catch up, she's going to have to do more than that. So that gives you an idea of that. But if we go to the next slide, let's see what that looks like. You can see this projected deficit that we've got there. That's the difference between what we're showing there, which is your public spending as a percentage of GDP, and actually the tax rate. Because you can see public spending at the moment for 24-25 is 44.4% of GDP, whereas the tax receipts is 35.3. That's that significant gap. That's what's driving that almost, well, not very hockey stick, but that increase that we're seeing on debt. That's why it looks as an unsustainable kind of outcome as we all. And then if you look over to the right hand side, you can see this is the 2024 figures, and you can see that you've got income tax and NICs, which together is almost half of the total tax take. You then got VAT and corporation tax. If you click on one more slide, that'll bring us forward into 25, 26. And you can see it shifts, and then 27, 28, and you can get all the way through to the end of the forecast, which is where you can see that tax has risen to about 37.5% of GDP. With income tax and NICs have slightly increased overall, but the shape of that chart, that pie chart, which by the way has increased by the same size, I noticed. That gives you the kind of analysis of where you're getting to. So 3/4 of your taxes are basically made up from your income tax and NICs plus VAT and corporation tax. So if you're wanting to get real money out of those are the areas you're going to need to get to. Though you might not go just by rates, you could do things like getting into the base, but those are the areas. By the time you're looking into duties or into council tax, business rates, and some of the other taxes, you are fishing in a much smaller pond. So therefore, making any changes that are material are going to have a much, much bigger impact on those particular taxpayers. And I think that's where we get into the kind of real challenge for the economy as a whole. So if I go to the next slide, this gives us back to what we thought we knew before. If you go back to the last budget, do you remember it was a once and done budget? We were going to go and raise 70 billion, of which 40 was going to come from taxes and 30 was going to come from borrowing. We have the commitment in the manifesto not to increase the national insurance by, I think there's a brackets employees, isn't there? Hidden
Yes.
in that phrase. National insurance, basic higher and additional rates of income tax or VAT. We also have the commitment not to raise corporation tax over the 25% rate that it is today. And we had Rachel in that speech basically, I'm really clear, I'm not coming back with more borrowing or more taxes. You couldn't make it much clearer than that. And then on the eve of, actually I think it was the morning of the Labour Party conference, you had Rachel answering the question about whether she stood by that statement. I think she says, and I quote, "I think everyone can see in the last year the world has changed and we're not immune to that change." As a way of saying, look, I'm abandoning my manifesto commitments. It's not a quite statement, but it does leave you open to those kind of. And to be fair to them, we have seen a significant increase in the demand for defence spending from 1.5 to 3 to 5%. So there is a lot of elements out there which could almost justify it. You can see on the other side, whether you go from the IFS, the IFG, or the CBI, we love our three-letter acronyms, don't we? They're all basically saying, look, actually, it might be better to do something that breaks your manifesto commitment rather than to try and do it by lots of different changes. But maybe we'll come on to the question. So if we come to the next slide, you asked me what the Chancellor's conundrum was. I was trying to muck that up into a set of letters and have some clever word with it, but I think I failed. But yes, the Chancellor's conundrum is those three. Does she continue to borrow, in which case we have that hockey stick, which doesn't look very palatable. 270% of GDP is a debt. That's not good.
And will sweep the market.
And will sweep the market, as we're seeing by that 30-year gilt level. Or will we actually go and raise some taxes, or we cut spend? Cutting spending, as I said, is really difficult. We've seen that being difficult to do in Parliament. And that's also akin to that 62% versus 34%, the seats versus the House. That gives you a bit more of a reason why it is so difficult to do that today, even though the numbers would look like. In order to help our discussion, I've put some illustrative increases on the next chart. I should stress these are not either recommendations or predictions, just to help us go through the discussion. So what you got on the left-hand side is some of the stuff that was picked up by Demos. I say picked up because they're not all their ideas. There's also some of those items picked up by Syntax. So you've got applying national insurance contributions to rental income, which is an interesting one. Of course, rental income is actually, you're taxed on the net income. Of course, interest is taken out, but it is an expense, which makes it harder to do a national insurance. Whereas you've seen some parties have said, well, we should reduce NICs and we should increase income tax. Challenge for doing that is it makes it much more overt what your effective tax rate is when you see the basic rate increasing. But that would at least bring some of those kind of profits in there. I'll jump on to the next one on capital gains. 11.3 billion in capital gains. That's a huge amount of change in the capital gains tax market. Now, that one involves, oh, sorry, if you can go back a slide. So the capital gains tax element includes both equalizing the capital gains tax rate and the income tax rates. And if you think, why have they not done that before? Well, one of the reasons they didn't do it before was carried interest, you know, the hedge funds and all those elements. Now they've taken carried interest out of capital gains and put it into income tax at a specific rate. That relieves that constraint on aligning the rates. So you could see an alignment to the rates. Of course, the last time they were aligned was actually back in 1998 when I advised, on introducing the taper relief. Which was designed to encourage businesses to basically invest and to be there for the longer term. One of the things this proposal does is it abandons that. It abandons what used to be entrepreneurs relief, or what Treasury christened the bad relief, business asset disposal relief. Personally, I think it's a good relief. I did come up with like great opportunity. I can't remember what but the point being is, if you were going to do this, I think you would actually need to reintroduce something on that basis to really encourage businesses to be here. The challenge we've got in the past is that people will make their money here, they'll leave, and then they'll make their gains abroad and never come back. One of the purposes of taper relief was that actually people sold while they were in the UK. And with all that cash, they then reinvested and became business angels. So that, I think, was one of, I'm biased, it's my policy, but it was a really good policy. And I think the danger of doing some of those ones in. It also removes the tax uplift on death that you get for that. And it introduces an exit tax. And exit taxes are really difficult. One of the things the UK has tried to do is to encourage people to come here. If you suddenly stop people leaving or propose an exit tax, particularly when they didn't know they were going to get that when they came here, there's a real question about should you be grandfathering. If you do an exit tax now and you were to do an immediate uplift or a revaluation, well, arguably that's possible, but then you're giving all the benefit to a future chancellor and taking all the grief now. And as a chancellor, that's not normally the kind of policies you really like. You'd much prefer to be a chance where you've got the gains now and the pain for a future chancellor. And maybe I'll pick that up in pensions and another one. You've got some other ones in there. You've got proportional property tax. That's basically changing council tax. You've got a rise in fuel duty. We have had 13 years of no rise in fuel duty. Of course, it's baked into the forecast. We would have a rise anyway. So that's on top of it. And then you've got some other illustrative ones out there. You've got things like a basic rate given caps is nigh on £7 billion, plus another 2 or just under 2 for the higher rate. I put the children's clothes in there, not because it's a large amount of money, but just to give the kind of point. So, and actually, if we go on to the next slide, you'll see why. Because embedded in all of this is there's a large amount, I said, of reliefs in the system. So if you think about the VAT release we have, which I think are in green, you can see there's quite a lot of bits where we have a 0 rate. If you take the children's clothes, my wife has small feet. People always wonder why I tell them this, but it means that she can get she can buy, if she buys her shoes downstairs, she gets no VAT because it's considered to be kids' shoes. Very nice kids' shoes, apparently. But if she buys them in the other one, then it's considered to be adult shoes. So the question here is, why is that a sensible use of the VAT system? Could when we were in the EU, see, I was going to mention the EU,
Yes,
we were obviously constrained. We couldn't ever introduce or change our or we could remove but not introduce. If you were to remove the VAT on children's clothes and you were to increase child benefit, you would basically change the system around. You would have a nice amount coming in on child benefit, a nice increase, and you would remove the VAT from everybody, including those who don't get child benefit. Now, 90% of households with children will claim child benefits, so there's only a 10% leeway. But then when you think about where that spending goes, that might go in your favour. So I raise the point here more as an example of other VAT and other items that you could do. Of course, those with long memories will remember the so-called omnishambles budget of 2012, where the last, but however many governments tried to, I was going to do that in Chancellors, but that's just too many, tried to do that. So you need to send the message. But I think if you're showing that you've got a commensurate increase in spending, then I think you end up with a much more coherent kind of answer. Of course, there are lots of elements in there. Pension schemes is a core one. One of the questions you've got is, I get asked quite a lot, is what are we going to see with pension schemes? You could, in theory, putting defined benefits aside for a moment, you could, in theory, reduce the tax rate you give on relief going into a pension today, cap that at 20%, but then also cap the money coming out of the pension at 20% in the future, because then you're doing a like-for-like deal. So at the moment, you get relief for your marginal rate to the extent you're allowed the relief, and then you'll pay tax at your marginal rate. You could have a 20 and 20 answer. If you did that, as a Chancellor, you get all the benefit now, of restricting it down to 20, and a future Chancellor gets much less money. Yeah. That feels the right way around if you're wanting to play the politics.
Well, it should be neutral over the whole.
It would be neutral. Yeah. Well, it might actually generate more revenue, because I'm not sure how many of the pensioners will be in the 40% when they when they take it out, even if they were 40 when they went in. But it would, in theory, be neutral across the piece. Of course, it's much more complicated than it sounds, because you've got defined benefits. People who are basically getting that into the system, who can't make a choice about the contributions they do because of their system. But over that time, that becomes so you'd have to sort something out. So it's not an easy policy, but it's just an example of the one which gives you a benefit as a Chancellor today at a cost for a Chancellor in the future. And if you're thinking of trying to deal with getting the debt levels down now, so you don't have that hockey stick of things, it's an interesting kind of idea. We jump to the next line. I promised I would leave time for questions. I've included a number of government policies up here. The ones that you can see in yellow are the ones that actually look to raise revenue, because if you look at some of the other ones, they're all about giving money away. So arguably, that's not where Rachel is going to be fishing in. If you look at the Lib Dems, you've got the windfall tax on the banks, and you'll hear all of those kind of items. You've got the question about the digital services tax. Of course, that's something that's under scrutiny with the US as well. Question whether that's about 0.9 billion of revenue, so not an inconsiderable amount that we've got there. We've also got other items out there under the green one and the green levies of looking at a kind of wealth tax. The Chancellor ruled out a kind of full wealth tax, but what else might you see? Arguably, that change in capital gains tax rate to the marginal income tax rate could be seen as effectively a tax on wealth. We jump to the next slide. It's not all upside. There are also some downsides in there and some real things to be worried about. We've got fuel duty to 26.3 billion. To the extent we're seeing more EVs coming on board, we're going to see less fuel duty. What is the answer to that? Is that a road pricing item? Lots of countries have it. We're not there yet. But actually, if you're a responsible government, you'll be thinking about how you're going to manage that. Do you do that by actual pricing? Do you do it by the number of miles on the road? So your MOT captures the number of mileage and do something simpler like that. There's a number of papers out there that give you the kind of proxies that might get you somewhere close to all of that. But then then we're going to see people trying to clock back the was it Ferris Bueller's Day Off? They had that where you clocked back and it went back. Yes, it was. I'm showing my age. You've also got the kind of questions, tobacco duty, DST. I already mentioned the 0.9 billion that we've got there. And if you look at that pillar 2, that's the domestic minimum tax, 1.2 billion. The income inclusion, it's got nigh on a billion, 0.8, so 800 million. That's basically where there are taxes overseas where people are not topping up to the 15% rate. Well, lots of countries are catching up on that. And introducing their QDMTs, their qualified domestic minimum top-up taxes, which means we'll lose that revenue anyway to that extent. And again, you've got your UTPR, the under-taxed profits rule, which is this rather potentially extraterritorial one, which says we can look sideways in a group even if we don't own those. That's definitely a one that's under challenge for by the US, obviously, with their changes, but we've got some elements there. We've also had lots of questions in terms of the support you actually need to give to the economy, whether that be business rates or whether that be stamp duty. So there are things there which, as a Chancellor, your base that you're working from is not that solid as well. If we go to the next slide, so where else could you get money? Well, I've put free money. Well, it's always nice to that. I'm afraid I haven't found a magic money tree here, but the whole question about could you do something about closing the tax gap? The tax gap being the difference between what you should receive per the law and what you do actually receive. And this comes from those kind of forecasts. And you can see that the previous Exchequer Secretary, James Murray, was very focused on this. It's one of his 3 targets he was wanting to make sure that HMRC closed in on the tax gap. And you can see it's looking at small business. Could you do some more things to make some of that tax more automatic? So you gather it first, and then if people want to reclaim overtax, the profits that have been overtaxed, they can then go and get that back from HMRC. Can you change that kind of environment? And at 5.3%, actually that's not very big by international standards, but it's still quite a lot of money when you think about it overall. And that's when we get into the kind of ideas of e-invoicing and those elements, which should make it easier for those things to manage. And if we jump to the next slide,
before we do, because that tax gap, 46.8 billion, that's roughly what the Conservatives say they can say in cutting public expenditure. I mean, how realistic is that?
Well, I mean, if you take that 46, it's also the bit we were showing is that gap that in our forecast. If you could actually get that in, that would be a massive saving to get our way through. It's the challenge of doing the tax gap. It's not the should we do it, it's the how do we do it. And you can see here, this is where HMRC has spent some of their or government has spent some of its money on trying to give more resources to HMRC to tackle that tax gap. And we had in the autumn budget, you can see 5,000 more people on in compliance staff, 2.75 billion coming in from that. They then supplemented it with more people. The spring statement, who are slightly lower, not 4 to 1, but 2.4 to 1 in terms of cost to revenue, which is slightly different to what they did on the debt management staff. They had 1,800 people and they got 7.6 to 1, so they're getting more bang for that. But then they recruited some more, even super debt management people in the spring statement, and they get 12 to 1. Well, they should have gone for the 12th one first, shouldn't they? But anyway, who knows what we'll see in this one? We might even get a higher number. But I think that's what the point there. They're trying to make sure they collect the debts that are out there. And to be fair to them, that might mean they were aware of more debts that they were due for collection that they didn't get. So those numbers are consistent, even if I'm being slightly facetious. We have a look at it.
Please. Do you think we would ever get to the position in the UK where the Chancellor would consider becoming a cashless economy? Because a lot of the tax gap is in the grey and black market, in my view. I know Modi looked at it in India and then rolled back. Can you see a future with that in it?
I mean, I guess it's all linked into the digital divide and trying to make sure that actually, because cash is still used by quite I'd say quite a few people. It is a subset of the economy. Personally, I think e-invoicing is the first step towards it, but that's only going into those that are VAT registered businesses and others. Once you get to that, I think you work your way through. I do think it's a natural phenomenon, and when we get there, and if you look at some of the other countries, and I'm lucky enough to travel in quite a few, you see all of the apps being used for money. You see, even if you look across Africa, you see the mobile money being used. You can see a lot more visibility of that. Once you have managed to get that to being the default or sufficiently default, I think you will see that kind of movement. We end up with when we think about where government is going on tax administration, we have this tax admin 3.0, which is the OECD's vision of where things go. That's fundamental to making sure that data comes into the tax authority. And I think losing cash, I think, is a key answer to that. Of course, what we also saw in India and other places was the reduction in the very, very large notes being withdrawn specifically to do that, to make it less attractive for large transactions to go through that. But I think if you look at the small business tax gap, that a lot of that is again a cash economy. The question is, can you address those kind of items? We've seen it in some places where if you, for example, if you get a VAT invoice, then you get entered into a lottery, or you get a lottery ticket or something like that. So we've done those kind of items, which have proven to be quite successful in encouraging people to do things. We've also seen it where governments provided things like an app for taxi drivers, that basically the taxi driver can manage all of their accounts on this app. And they changed the law, this is in Russia, they changed the law so that the taxi drivers, rather than paying tax on their income, or their net income, they would basically pay a turnover tax. So by using this app, which did all your accounts for you, it just took 4% off the top and played it paid it over. And that again was a good example of the non-cash economy, trying to think of new technology ideas that would allow you to reduce that tax gap. And in a number of countries, we have tax systems which effectively say, like that 4%, we're just going to go and say we go down this route. And indeed, in the VAT space, of course, we have the flat rate VAT scheme, which is designed exactly to try and remove that type of tax administration. I think that takes me to my last slide, which was my penultimate slide, which is the kind of timing one. Clearly, we've got a budget coming up on the 26th. The Chancellor herself did, I think, say the other day that no one knows what's in her budget, and anyone saying any otherwise is just completely lying and guessing. I'm definitely not saying what's in her budget, but hopefully what I've set out is some of the kind of constraints that she's under. To be fair, I don't think she knows what's in her budget yet either, because she's got to wait for the final forecast to come back from the OBR, and that will kind of shape the kind of key elements that she's got within it. And if we go to my last slide, I think that comes back to my 3 key points, that there are possibilities to go to the next slide. There are possibilities to meet the fiscal rules that really do not need to breach the manifesto.
Can we flip on to the next slide? Potentially. Oh,
yeah, there we go. So she has got possibilities to meet the fiscal rules and to go and raise that. She can do that without breaching the manifesto commitments. You could go and do it by lots of little things compared to a few big things. But as a former government advisor, former policy advisor, I have a kind of pain index and on each policy, and the pain index is almost aligned on one policy gives you the same amount of pain. Maybe not quite, but maybe one policy will give you twice as much pain. But my point is, if you have 10 policies compared to 2 policies, you're bound to be getting more pain for your buck than you will if you do a few.
Yeah.
So I think that comes back down to the fundamental choice that she has: is does she go and take a few big hits on maybe 1 or 2 on the manifesto commitments, or does she want instead to go and try and meet those requirements, but risk having lots and lots of different pain points will come back to get her, particularly in that stuff where you've got lots of MPs who will be biased over particular areas and particular things affecting their constituents. So I think it's a real challenge. To come back to your very first question, we will be waiting to see what she has. She has. Normally in this time of the cycle, you want to raise money, and you want to raise money that you can then go and spend later. So meaning that you're just going to hit your headroom and get back to the 9.9 billion. That's not very attractive. And even 40-50 billion to do that is a painful way to do something. But once you get past this, you're getting much closer to when the electorate will actually have a say so, and when you will have an environment where you will not have enough time for your policies to develop, to deliver the goods it needs to. So really, this is, again, one of the big, in the cycle, this is a big tax raising budget. And I think that's the kind of messages that we still keep hearing.
Would you agree that she rather missed the fuss on the basis that when she discovered this so-called black hole, that was the time to say, because of that, I am going to have to break my manifesto commitment and raise the taxes that actually make the big difference?
Well, if I go back to the first year, so we had L Day, legislation day, I think the 29th of July. And that was the time where we saw the winter fuel allowance. And then we had the big long gap to the end of October for the budget. If it had been me, I would have been thinking more about doing something on that 29th. I would have gone early with some items that had gone through and taken that one, which I think goes to your point. I'm not sure I would have said I would have breached the manifesto commitments at that point, but by the time we get to the March and the spring statement, I mean, the Chancellor made a commitment to only have one fiscal event a year, and not to use the spring statement as a and Gordon Day a pre-budget report or a mini budget. But that was the point when we had the defence budget going from 1.5% up to 3 to 5. And that I would have thought would have been a time when you could have had a good, strong argument that, look, we came in with a budget that had this levelling, we're having to increase spend. That's something we couldn't predict. In her own words, as she said in the Day programme, look, we're in a different world. I think that would have been a more palatable time. We've got a budget in the last 2 weeks of November, which on one side is really good because that's what she promised. The Labour's partnership with business document published just before the election said we will have spring statement in the first 2 weeks of March and we'll have the budget in the last 2 weeks of August. Last week of November, sorry. Those are the two. She actually didn't do the spring statement at the beginning of March. She did it at the end, but she stuck to doing the budget at the end of November. That's giving us a long time for the drip of policies here. But I think you could have brought forward those times. I think the time, I think it's still possible to make that argument, but it was much more front of mind when we were talking about those kind of defence in the March time.
Do you think realistically she can cut any public expenditure, or in practice that's just so difficult to do, she can't really look at that lever at all?
I don't think it's impossible. I think you need to bring your MPs with you. And I think the challenge is to work out, I think they have found what they can't deliver, and they therefore need to work on what the things that they can deliver and how to do that. But I'm sure there will be areas where you could do that. It's notoriously difficult. If you look at the look in local government, I think it was Kent, wasn't it, who said they were going to be making lots of savings from spending, and then came out and said, well, actually, we're going to go and increase local taxes anyway. So you've got those kind of challenges in there. I think it's the same as removing a tax relief. It's much harder to take something away than it is not to give it in the first place. And that's, I think, one of the questions that I think she'll be quite cautious about.
Are there any questions online, Craig? I mean, in the meantime, RJ, one question that always occurs to me, Chris, is that when economic circumstances look particularly challenging and I start to worry about it too much, I always think to myself, oh, we've been here before. The 1970s was financial crisis after financial crisis. To what extent is that true, and to what extent do you think things are very different now? I suppose you've answered that in pieces over the course of the last 45 minutes, but
well, I should be careful not to paint too gloomy a picture.
Yeah.
I mean, if we think about where we are we think about the global economy, the UK still has a huge amount of things attracting people to come here. And then under the EY attraction survey, we're still number 2 in Europe,
Yeah.
and we're catching up on number 1. So there's a lot of things drawing people to the UK. There's a lot of turmoil around the rest of the world. And actually, the UK could quite easily become the safe haven for people to come to and be here if we got the right policies. Clearly, what we've seen in the non-dom policies and the introduction and the removal of the non-dom regime has basically changed quite a lot of that and has spooked a lot of that type of market. But potentially that's A, reversible, and B, some clear sets of policies about what's going on there could actually drive this. We've also seen some really positive things by the government. We saw the consultation on tax certainty for inbound investment, where businesses coming to the UK can actually get, if you like, a pre-clearance of any tax uncertainty they've got about that investment. That's a really good news story, and that's the Treasury putting the kind of resources where it needs to draw those kind of items. So we are seeing a lot of those kind of elements and a lot of the positive things. We've seen some of the kind of tax technical questions, things like cost sharing agreements, which is notoriously difficult between UK and US companies. That's now being addressed in a much more positive environment. So we're seeing all of those things. It's just those are all the good things that are happening underneath, if you like, in the bonnet. But actually, when we're looking at the car, we're looking at the flat tire rather than realizing the engine is perfect once we pump the tire up.
Yeah.
And if we could just change the wheel, then actually we'd probably be doing really well. That's not mixing my metaphor.
No, that's very clear metaphor. Craig, and
No questions.
no questions on that. Any more? Yes.
Chris, you meant on one of the slides you had principal private residence as one
Yes.
of the big tax reliefs out there, and also there is the element where capital gains tax kind of changing a lot of the rates, bringing them into income tax, could also be a big earner.
Income less rates, but yeah.
Yes, yeah, which means that probably it could end up being one of the bigger circles in your large slide, not necessarily having much of a damaging effect on their manifesto pledges, maybe voter base. Do you think there could be some aspects that could cause some difficulties with the tackling?
I think that's a really. I mean, I think those are difficult ones. I think capital gains is a difficult one to do. If you are, well, first of all, you take the principal private residence relief. People have bought on the houses on the basis they've got that level of expectation in relation to it. If you were going to do that, you would also probably want to cap it. So not you would choose a level below which you wouldn't have any capital gains tax. And then, of course, you're then saying, well, I've got no records for the last 20 years in which I've done that. So you would probably have to rebase to a certain date. And by that time, you can see that money just going down and down and down as you put all of these things in. And it dangerously looks like you're going to take all the grief now for the benefit of a future chancellor. This is the wrong, as we know, is the wrong way around. So I think that's quite difficult. You might do it if you wanted to say, actually, those with the broadest shoulders are bearing the most. You might do that for the future, but you wouldn't expect to get much cash from it. So I think when you're thinking of a budget like this, you're thinking about what's your messaging and what's your revenue. And I don't think it fits in the revenue part. I think an exit tax is a really dangerous thing to do, and I think they would be very wary about doing that kind of item, unless again you were to rebase it, in which case you're back into the same pay now benefits of the future. So I don't think that would be a large item, even though it was a large item in the Demos one. And ultimately, you want to encourage. Remember, the Chancellor said her priority is to boost growth. And if we start by saying we're going to tax all of our entrepreneurs here who are based on with a large tax charge, then you don't actually get that encouraged growth. Now, when we introduced taper relief, it wasn't actually over the basis that capital gains was a deterrent for you setting up a company, because actually most entrepreneurs want to start up a company and they think about capital gains in the future. But it was actually about the entrepreneur who was leaving, that business angel, that person becoming a serial entrepreneur, or not. I think they mistyped it in one budget. It said social entrepreneur, which is something different. But trying to keep them in as being a serial entrepreneur, trying to make sure they got them into that. So I think you would need to introduce that. So I don't believe you've got such a big amount of money that in that space. And I think if you don't do that, it's about 20% of gains coming from non-business assets. So 80% of that is coming in the business space, by which I think you would need to protect. That's why I don't think it's a big revenue raiser. I think it might be an emotional one that you do, and you might do that for the future. You might do that for messaging, but not from a revenue perspective.
Thank you. I appreciate we started late. We are over the scheduled time. Any final thoughts or observations? I mean, we could have another half an hour with you, to be honest with you. Chris, I wanted to hear your views about declining productivity and all sorts of things, but I think that's probably going to have to wait for another day. I get you're rushing off to Chris, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I think we all enjoyed that a lot more than we will enjoy a big budget on the day. And I thank you very much for that. And I hope that you will be able to join us at our budget banquet in the spring as our guest. By which time, of course, we'll all be feeling the effect of whatever happens on the 26th of November. Our next 30th anniversary webcast is on the 3rd of November, when Liveram and Tom Wallace will be sharing the benefit of his deep experience of navigating HMRC inquiries. Tom was a tax inspector for 20 years and is now Director of Tax Investigations at WTT. So that's, I think, a must for anyone in practice. Finally, thank you very much, Chris, and of course your team behind the scenes who support you. Thank you to Craig Chatwin and to QX for hosting us this morning, and to all of you here in the Shard and online who joined us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.